Okay, share my screen here. All right, so Veronica, as always, feel free to interrupt me because I cannot see the Q&A while I'm presenting. And like I said, if you have a question, go ahead and ask it in the Q&A. And if we can, Veronica will interrupt me if she feels like it's something to address in the moment. So today we're talking about citing and introducing sources. I wanted to present on this because this idea of citation is something that comes up quite a bit in our work at the Academic Writing Center, primarily when we have novice scholars who are really just learning the stylistic differences for citations, and also starting to get more confident and comfortable evaluating the work of other scholars. And so when you're introducing sources, you're not only citing them, but you're also providing pertinent details, even transitional words and phrases, to give the reader a hint in terms of what your attitude is towards the source's material. And so I find that if you look at the work of a novice scholar versus someone who has been, a researcher for a longer period of time and has more experience writing, you will see some very clear differences in terms of how they cite and introduce sources. And so I want to go over these different forms and techniques with you today, and hopefully you'll learn something and be able to take what you learned today and immediately start applying it in your writing. So a little bit about me. Like I said a moment ago, I'm the founder and CEO of the Academic Writing Center and Dissertation by Design. I'm a healthcare researcher, educator, and an academic coach. I'm a reviewer for several prominent healthcare journals. Before I started my first company, Dissertation by Design, I was a senior research director at Northeastern University School of Nursing and Harvard School of Dental Medicine. And I've authored 11 peer-reviewed publications and quite a few grants. So I know a thing or two about academic writing. So these are my two companies, the Citation by Design and the Academic Writing Center. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to our websites, dissertationbydesign.com, theacademicwritingcenter.com. And then I want to give you a little more information about the Academic Writing Center because I did start the Writing Center last year, and we're actively growing our community. And the Writing Center was born just out of an observation that I had through years of working with graduate students, which is that just kind of across the board, the typical university writing center model really doesn't work well for doctoral students for a number of reasons. And so I created the Writing Center in order to address some of those problems that I've been noticing for the past several years through my interactions with faculty and grad students. And so the Writing Center is a virtual academic writing community. We hold at least 4 workshops a month, if not more. We have writing retreats several times a month, at least once a week. We also have an academic writing repository where we record workshops and store resources for our community members. And we also offer one-on-one writing support. We just started offering small group writing support, which has been a big hit. And we're calling those office hours, where a maximum of 4 people can drop in and meet with a writing coach as a small group and get real-time feedback on their writing. And so if you're curious, our on-demand library, this is where we record all of our workshops and resources. So you can see there's quite a few topics here. So you would have access to all of these resources as a community member. And this is our schedule for March, in case you're curious to see how many times we meet. So we have office hours several times a month. In March, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 office hours. The workshops that we're talking about this month, we're talking about critical appraisal tools, punctuation, writing a CV, and then how to use ChatGPT to boost your research writing. So lots of different topics, which you can attend live or go in and watch the recordings too. So with that said, I'm now going to just jump into today's presentation. We have quite a few items on our agenda. We're going to start by talking about the challenges associated with citing and introducing sources. Then I'll talk about 3 forms of citation, then 3 techniques for citing and introducing sources. And then I'm going to show you examples of how to apply each of these techniques in your writing. So let's just first talk about why is it challenging to correctly cite and introduce sources. Well, first of all, it's time consuming. You're going through this process of simultaneously locating, reading, and recording information. And maybe you're recording that information, taking detailed notes in an annotation table or using a reference management software. Regardless, there's a lot happening all at once. And so I find that some people tend to put placeholders for citations because they don't want to interrupt their flow of writing. So then you have to take the time later to go back in and find the citations and integrate them into the writing. But then there's also the process of as you're writing, you have to make sure that you're not only paraphrasing correctly, and paraphrasing is also challenging, especially for novice writers, but that you're interpreting the source correctly so that you're introducing it correctly. And so that's also challenging. There's also stylistic differences. Maybe your doctoral program follows APA, but maybe you've just graduated and you're writing a journal article and you have to now learn MLA or Chicago style. And so that adds another layer of complexity. And then through this whole process, in order to appropriately introduce a source, you need to be able to interpret it correctly. And this involves critical reading. And so what I see time and again is that when scholars rush this process, they tend to do what we call dropped quotations, is something I see very frequently. And this is an example of a dropped quotation where you have a full sentence that's a direct quote. And there really isn't a proper introduction to the quote. It's not clear who you're citing or why you're citing them. And so I have an example here where this writer said, a number of journalists have been critical of genetic engineering. And then this full sentence quote, the problem is no one really knows the long-term effects of such complex genetic manipulation, and the potential dangers to humans and the environment are substantial. So in this example, yes, there is a citation at the end. So this isn't plagiarism. But it's not really clear to me, who is this Turner person? Why do we care about this specific quote? Could this have been paraphrased? As an instructor in a dissertation chair, something that I also think when I see direct quotes is, I think perhaps this student or this writer isn't comfortable paraphrasing. So they don't really understand this quote and they're just dropping it in. Perhaps they're rushing. And so we really want to avoid this. I try to set, my kind of rule of thumb is to use direct quotations very sparingly. There's no perfect rule of thumb, but I tell my students I don't want to see more than one per page because it is best to paraphrase. But if you are going to use one, you need to introduce it. You need to add some context to help the reader understand why you're quoting a specific source. So I'm going to give you some strategies for doing that today. I want to start with, I want to just take a poll. What do you find most challenging when citing and introducing sources? We talked about some of these challenges. I'm just curious to hear from you. Do you feel that it's just really time consuming? Do you lack confidence paraphrasing? Do you have difficulty learning the style guide? Do you question your ability to evaluate sources? Perhaps it's all of the above or none of the above. Let me just launch this poll one moment. I have to stop sharing in order to poll. Give me just a second. Okay, here we go. If you could just take a moment to complete the poll. I'm just curious to hear from everyone here. Yeah, a lot of you say it's time consuming, all of the above. It's pretty split. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and show you the results. So 21% of you say it's time consuming, 19% you lack confidence paraphrasing, fewer of you learning the style guide is a challenge, all the above 19%. So yeah, I mean, hopefully what you see by seeing this is that other people struggle with this as well. I think oftentimes when we're writing, we're not even thinking about this in terms of a major component of the writing process. We just think of it as kind of it's required without actually considering how much goes into citing and introducing sources in order to do it well, in order for the writing to be cohesive. And so with these challenges, oftentimes it leads to a number of outcomes where we have an incorrect either citation or introduction to a source. You could either make the mistake of not citing at all, which is plagiarism. Hopefully you're not doing that. Or maybe you're citing a secondary source. That's also something important to consider when you're citing studies. Or maybe you're attributing information to the wrong source. Maybe you have a drop quote, like the example I gave just a moment ago, with no introduction or explanation. Maybe there's lack of context or inappropriate reporting verbs. So these are all kind of things that can come about if you're not really intentionally thinking about how you're citing and introducing your sources. So let's dive in. What I want you to take away today are these three different forms of citation. There are different ways you can cite sources. I could do a whole presentation just on these different forms, but I'm just going to give you like a high level overview. So when you're citing sources, you're thinking about these forms of citation. So first of all, when you cite sources, there are a number of reasons to do this. You need to do it when you're paraphrasing. You need to do it when you're quoting. These are the most obvious instances. Also, when you're summarizing another source's ideas, or if you're building on their ideas, it's important to distinguish between what was the original source's idea and then what's your sort of expansion of that idea. And then also if you're using a table or a figure, you need to make sure that you're citing the source there as well. And so there are three forms of citation, and this is really taken from APA 7. There are stylistic differences. For the purposes of today, I'm going to focus on really APA 7. So the first is a narrative citation, and this is an example of what that looks like, according to, and then we have the author. Or a parenthetical citation, that's where the citation is within the parentheses. We often see these at the end of sentences, or when you're listing out, different results or aspects of studies, maybe at multiple points in the sentence. And then the bibliographic citation. And so what I find is when I'm talking to novice researchers, they're often thinking about these two forms, the parenthetical citation and the bibliographic citation. I find that narrative citations tend to come about with slightly more experienced writers because they start to learn different ways to introduce sources with signal phrases. But these are the three common forms, particularly with APA 7. And so let's break these down. A narrative citation is using a word or phrase to introduce material from another source. You're identifying the authors of the source material in the narrative citation. And then using these helps you to avoid dropped quotes. Like I said, we don't want a full sentence that's just a citation. We want to include a narrative citation to introduce that source. And later, we'll also talk about using transition words and phrases and signal phrases and reporting verbs to introduce sources, but we're not there yet. So these are just a few examples of narrative citations. According to, or Blight et al. Reported, or in 2023, Blight et al. Discovered. These are all different ways that you can include a citation within the narrative of the writing. And so these are the three forms together. So we have here a narrative citation in the beginning of this paragraph, according to a literature review by O'Reilly. And then we have these different types of parenthetical citations. I have them underlined in orange. In this sentence, the parenthetical citations all fall at the end of the sentence. And then here in this sentence that starts with however, this parenthetical citation is in the middle of the sentence. And so this is important to notice because some people make the mistake of just always listing the parenthetical citations at the end of the sentence. And that is only appropriate if everything in that sentence is attributed to those citations. which is what is implied here because they all fall at the end. So what that tells me as a reader is that these 3 studies, different authors, all kind of are in agreement on everything that's listed in this sentence. Whereas in the next sentence, the Capaldi et al. Citation is used to cite the information in the beginning of the sentence, and then the additional information that's provided at the end of the sentence is attributed to a different source. And so that is intentional, and that is the way to correctly integrate those sources into that one sentence. And now we have another narrative citation, and then we have another parenthetical citation at the bottom, a couple of them. And then the bibliographic citation is more obvious. That's your reference list. That's where you have your sources like completely cited in the reference list. And so this is just in one paragraph, shows you 2 different forms of citations where the authors are kind of going back and forth between these narrative and parenthetical citation forms. So I'm curious to hear from you, with those in mind, the parenthetical, the narrative, you should always have a reference list with bibliographic citations. Do you tend to use one more than another? I'm going to launch this poll. Doesn't like me to launch the poll when I'm showing my PowerPoint. Okay, I launched the poll. You could just tell me which form you use the most. Hopefully you're using a balance of both, but like I said, I do find that in novice researchers, particularly, first or second year grad students, that they really tend to mostly use parenthetical citations. Good, we have a good mixture here. I'm going to launch these results. So it looks like 44% of you use primarily parenthetical, and then about half of you use a balance of both. This is exactly what I was expecting to see. And if we were to do a study on this, I'd be curious to know like how much experience you have as a writer. Because like I said, a lot of folks tend to lean towards parenthetical when they're just learning how to write as researchers and scholars. Okay, I'm going to go back to my screen. Okay, we're going to transition now to introducing sources. This is a longer part of the webinar. Veronica, I'm just going to take a moment and pause to see if any sort of questions or comments have come up about what we've discussed so far. And if not, I'll just keep going.
Yeah, let's see here. I just wanted to, someone asked a question about citing material that's in a journal that they're citing. So that, I responded that this is a great question. It's called secondary citating, referencing, and how to go to the original article. If it's important enough, go to the original article. But I didn't know if you had something else to say about citing material that's in another journal.
Yeah, so if we were going, I'm a very visual person, so I'm going to go back to this example. So let's say you're reading this article and you notice this Capaldi reference and you're like, oh, this is interesting. This is something that I want to comment on in my research. You don't want to cite the person who wrote this article, which is cited here. Scafida wrote this article that I took the screenshot of. You want to go to the Capaldi reference and first verify that, because maybe this author interpreted this correctly or didn't attribute the information correctly. So you always want to go to the original source. You want to really stay away from doing things like saying, as cited in Scafida et al. You want to go to the actual source. And that is part of what makes this so time consuming. I find that when we're rushing, or even I'm guilty of this, where I'll make a note for myself. I'll assume that it's correct, but then I'll make a note for myself that I need to go pull the primary source because I don't want to interrupt the flow of my writing. But that's part of this being a critical reader, is not taking another author's word for it, going to the primary source to make sure that it was interpreted correctly, and citing the primary source in your writing. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And then one more just came through with how do you determine the cadence between the different types of citations to use?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's no like rule of thumb for that. I think so. This is something I would include as part of the revision process. I think at least my natural writing style is to use parenthetical citations. That just feels more natural to me when I'm sitting down to write. But during the revision process, I will go through and sort of strategically ask myself certain questions. Like, so for instance, let's say that this is and this kind of is going also into the next part of the presentation, but if it's your first time citing an author, like let's say in this example, in this full article, this is the first time O'Reilly was cited, then including some additional details the first time you cite a source, and that requires more of an introduction and a signal phrase. So then I'll intentionally go in and add details and sort of rearrange the structure of sentences so that I have a balance of both. But it shouldn't be arbitrary. I think a big takeaway from this presentation is it's intentional. The way that you're introducing and citing sources is a component of the writing process. It's not just, oh, now is the time to cite. And it all depends on your argument and the point you want to make. So for example, let's say part of your core argument is around a methodological gap. Then it would be prudent to introduce sources based on the different types of methodologies that they use to conduct their research. Instead of just throwing in parenthetical citations, you would strategically introduce a source the first time it's cited by saying in a systematic review or in a qualitative study, because those are different details that you want the reader to sort of remember to keep in mind before you kind of draw this conclusion that there is a methodological gap. And so it is strategic and it is intentional, and it depends on what you're observing in the literature, how you've evaluated the literature, and what your argument is for your study.
Yeah, Jessica, I think I would add to that, that if I'm reporting on someone's specific findings and I want to highlight their methodology or their theory that they use, then that's when I really use those the narrative form in the actual sentence rather than with a parenthetical.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'm just looking at an example to see if there's anything else I wanted to point out about that. If this has something, let's see.
I know that when I'm looking at writing, if I see people making a big claim and then chunking up the different findings within that claim and using references for each particular finding, do you know what I mean? I don't see one here, but let's say that in the one that you have underlined in orange, let's say that Afrazel et al. Specifically talked about stratification abuse experiences and international maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. So
yeah, so do you mean like they did that in this one? I don't have it underlined where this sentence.
Oh yeah. There you go. The next one.
Yeah, they break it up. To go back to what I was saying about highlighting certain aspects of the study, this first sentence is a good example of that. So imagine if, and this wouldn't be wrong per se, but there's additional details here based on the way they introduced it. So imagine if this first sentence was written as that first narrative citation was gone, and it just said, there is a paucity of literature on domestic abuse against women in their childbearing years, and particularly in the postnatal period. And then there was a parenthetical citation, O'Reilly 2007. That wouldn't be incorrect. But what's helpful is now I know as a reader that O'Reilly conducted a literature review. It wasn't just a single study where the author said there's a paucity of literature. this author conducted a lit review and found a paucity of literature. So that adds more weight to the claim that there's a paucity of literature. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. It just adds more.
I think that makes that much clearer.
Yeah. Okay, these are good questions. Okay, now we're going to talk about introducing sources. I broke these into two parts, but they're very much intertwined. I just didn't want to confuse you guys with like the three forms of citation and then these three different ways to introduce sources. But these all go hand in hand. When you're introducing a source, you're obviously also going to cite a source. So there's three ways to introduce sources: signal phrases, which contain reporting verbs, and then transition words and phrases. So we're going to talk about those. So when you introduce a source, it's often when you first cite a source, instead of just adding a parenthetical citation, there are reasons to add a bit more information to introduce a source, just like in that example I showed you. When you paraphrase new material from the same source, you may want to introduce a source differently based on the material you're presenting. And when you quote a source, these are all instances when you want to introduce a source instead of just dropping in a parenthetical citation. So one way to introduce a source is using a signal phrase. This is just a short phrase to introduce material from another source. It's a little bit beyond when we talk about the narrative citation. So a narrative citation doesn't have to contain a signal phrase, but it can. So for instance, you may say according to, and then insert the author. That would just be a narrative citation. But if you also introduce it to include a reporting verb, then that would be a signal phrase. And we'll look at some examples here. And then signal phrases also help to provide a seamless transition from the author's idea to the source's ideas. So here's two examples. This right here is a narrative citation, but when taken together, it includes, we have a signal phrase here. So according to Blight et al., who reported in a recent systematic review on nurse burnout and its impact on the national nurse shortage, and then we have a direct quotation. So all of this taken together before the quote begins is the signal phrase, which contains a reporting verb and a narrative citation. Here's another example where we just have in Blight et al.'s systematic review on nurse burnout, the authors argued. So again, this is a signal phrase, and then we have a reporting verb here. And so reporting verbs are a key component of a signal phrase, and it's really important to understand the implications, the nuances of meaning whenever you choose a reporting verb. I find, especially just speaking for myself, when I first started writing, when I had my first research study, I tended to use like the same reporting verbs over and over, like the authors stated, the authors reported, the authors found, which tend to be more neutral reporting verbs. And that's because I wasn't yet comfortable using argumentative language or strongly worded reporting verbs because I was new. And so you may find that as well. But these reporting verbs that you use in signal phrases, there are three main functions of them. First, they indicate the source's viewpoint. So this requires for you to correctly understand and interpret the source's viewpoint. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to go back to this example. If in my writing, I'm saying that Blight et al. Argued, then that needs to be correct. If you go to that source and read that systematic review and they're not actually arguing for the need for workplace burnout interventions, then that means I have misinterpreted the source's viewpoint. So that's what I mean by indicating the source's viewpoint. It also indicates your viewpoint on the source's work. And so I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. And then it's also your viewpoint on existing literature. Perhaps you've reviewed all the literature on the topic and you're surprised that there's a gap, or you're angry about this gap and you want to argue for the need for policy or a change in approach. So all of this language that you're using has a meaning, and it's important for you to understand the implications of these words that you're using, specifically in this case, reporting verbs and your signal phrases. And so, like I said, all of this requires you to understand and correctly interpret the source's work. And it requires you to understand these different shades of meaning. So this all goes back to why this is challenging, why introducing sources is so much more than just throwing in a citation to prevent plagiarism. I find that we're often so focused on not plagiarizing that we forget to think about all these other components of the writing that are important. So these are the classification of reporting verbs. So we have tentative, neutral, and strong. I have a handout that I'm going to send you with the recording, but this is just kind of an overview of some of the most common ones in each category. So like I said a moment ago, I found that when I first started writing, I used a lot of neutral reporting verbs, and I just wasn't yet comfortable. I didn't have a lot of confidence in my writing and my research abilities. I didn't yet feel comfortable like really understanding or critically evaluating another source's work. But over time, if you look at my writing now, you'll see that I use all three. I sometimes use tentative or strong reporting verbs because I'm much more comfortable now at feeling like I'm correctly interpreting the source's viewpoint, and I'm developing my own viewpoint on the source's work. And so I'm just curious to hear from you. I don't think I have a poll on this. No. I'm curious to know if you are realizing something about your writing, if you're starting to see that maybe you do use mostly neutral reporting verbs. I see some people are raising their hand. Veronica, I don't know if we have some questions that I could address here.
Yeah, I don't see, they'd have to put it in the Q&A. Here's one. It's just a question. Reporting verbs, should they be past tense?
Oh, that depends. That's a whole other presentation. Yes and no. It depends. I actually have an article that I was reading when I was kind of putting the finishing touches on this presentation. And if I remember, I can share it with you. And it's about the 3 different tenses that are used with reporting verbs. And it is also determined by your style guide. So, for instance, if you're referring to previously conducted research, then that's past tense. But if you're talking about the methods of your study, you're reporting on the methods of your study, then perhaps that's in present tense. Or if it's an ongoing issue where there's a current debate, then it could be present simple tense. So it really depends. There's no rule of thumb that says it's always in past or present tense. It depends on the section of writing and whether or not it's an ongoing issue or debate in the field, or if it's just previously conducted research. So, yeah.
It looks like the people who put in the Q&A, it's mostly neutral.
Yeah, that's very common. I kind of went down a rabbit hole and I found all these articles on studies of reporting verbs and like novice scholars and expert scholars. And overwhelmingly, novice scholars use neutral reporting verbs. And then we see shifts over time as they become expert scholars. They tend to, it doesn't mean that you're going from neutral to strong. It just means that you are recognizing the difference. And within a piece of writing by an expert scholar, you'll see all 3 of these because there are usually instances where you would use a tentative verb in one sentence and then a neutral reporting verb in the next, just depending on the source.
Yeah, and then I think a person picked up on a typo here. It has donuts in the tentative verbs.
Yeah, seeing if you're paying attention. Yeah, that's definitely autocorrect. Thanks.
And then one question was, do you have any citation tips on legal cases?
Oh, I'm definitely not a legal scholar. I don't.
Yeah, I can't. I know that I've worked on helping people with studies that include the legal cases. I still think that we use past tense, but we were following APA, and APA is one of the guidelines that says if you're referring to research or litigation or legislative acts, that sort of thing, to refer to past tense. So I don't know, we'd have to check on that one, Carol Lee.
Yeah. Yeah, because for the most part, I mean, when you're talking about a study or something that's happened in the past where a legal case has like a beginning and end date and conclusions were drawn or recommendations were made or policy changes were implemented, those things happen in the past. But again, there are exceptions to this. And so it's specific to your field of study, your discipline, and your style guide. So this is where, kind of the style guide is so important. A lot of people incorrectly think of their style guide as only caring about their citations, their reference list, their headings, but it's so much more than that. It's about tense, it's about voice, even hyphenations, the use of italics, how you format block quotes, capitalization, all the things.
Yeah, Jessica, I will say just one more thing. Someone else asked a question about military codes and regulations. And so that got me to thinking, if it is something that is in place right now, we would perhaps use present tense, and military codes and regulations, I think, are one of those things that I would probably refer to in present tense. So just a thought there.
Yeah. So for instance, I tend to think about clinical, because I'm a healthcare researcher, clinical guidelines in this way. So if there's a current clinical guideline in place right now, then I'm going to say researchers recommend, because it's a current recommendation. But if I'm talking about the study that was conducted, and one of the studies that were conducted in the past that went into those recommendations, I'm going to refer to that specific study in past tense, because there's a clear start and end date and time. But if it's a current recommendation, then I'll use present tense. Yeah.
Perfect.
So it's also important when you're introducing sources, and this is particular to APA 7. I know that there are stylistic differences, but to use active voice. And this helps you kind of transition from also a parenthetical citation. So if you're starting to notice that you have a lot of parenthetical citations, then it's likely that you may also have quite a bit of passive voice. And so this is an example of how to transform an instance where there's a parenthetical citation with passive voice to a narrative citation with active voice. So here it just says the impact of this policy was evaluated by healthcare researchers. And then we cite the source here with a parenthetical citation. In order to get rid of that passive voice, you can then change this to, Klein and colleagues assessed the impact. And so now you have a narrative citation and you have active voice. So that's just kind of a tip. If you're being told that you have a lot of passive voice in your writing, then go through and identify, are there areas where you have parenthetical citations where you could change it to a narrative citation and address the issues of passive voice. So then we have transition words and phrases. These are really important for establishing connections between ideas and sources, and it guides the reader and improves coherence. And so we have these different categories of transition words and phrases. They have categories include causation, chronology, combinations, contrast, examples. There's a lot here, and I'm going to send you this handout with the recording. And there are implications of using these words and phrases in your writing, just like there are with signal phrases and reporting verbs. And I'm just going to go through a few examples here. Causation is an important connection that you might want to make, and there's specific transition words and phrases you can do to indicate causation. And like I said earlier, there's one aspect of this is just getting through the writing. You don't have to perfect it in the first draft or even the second draft. Maybe you always use the same, transition word accordingly when you're talking about causation. That's okay. What I typically do is in the revision process, in one read through, I'm trying to find different synonyms for those transition word and phrases to not only mix it up, but also to just double check myself to make sure that I'm using the correct term, that I wasn't just writing too quickly and not really thinking about sort of the implications of the transition word and phrases that I was using. Then there's chronology. This one tends to be a little more straightforward in terms of how you're connecting sources based on when they occurred. Then you have combinations and lists. You have contrasts, providing examples, highlighting the importance of something, of information, location, connecting elements. Oops, did I skip a slide? Oh no. So with those transition words and phrases, I'm going to kind of bring this all together because I like looking at everything with examples. So let's take this paragraph on preconception interventions in the workplace. I went ahead and did the difficult work for you. I highlighted what I want you to pay attention to. And so in this second instance here, this author is introducing a source, Klein and colleagues. And so that's a narrative citation. And then they're using a signal phrase. They're using the word assessed as the reporting verb before they finish this sentence. So I gave that example earlier. But then here they transition to a parenthetical citation where they're paraphrasing and they're citing the sources at the end. But included in this is a transition phrase, further examples. So this is where you're clarifying for the reader. You're providing a point of clarification using a transition phrase. And then if we go down here, we have another narrative citation embedded within the signal phrase where they're introducing the source. And in this example, they're referencing a specific aspect of the study based on the point that they want to make in that sentence. And so when we think about signal phrases and introducing sources, it's not always just saying according to or they reported. We want to include relevant information based off of the point that we want to make. We're going to look at some more examples. Here's an example that I took earlier where I pointed out the 3 forms of citation. And here I'm highlighting some other components. So I have here a signal phrase with a tentative reporting verb, suggest, international research to date suggest. And then however is a transition word to indicate contrast. That's here. This is where they're contrasting the sources, the findings from this sentence to another sentence with different sources. Then here they're saying existing evidence concludes. This is a strong reporting verb to signal a strong claim. And then here we have a neutral reporting verb. Some papers do explore. And so as you can see here, there's a mixture of reporting verbs in terms of strong and neutral. There's different transition terms, words and phrases to connect the sources. And then different signal phrases based on what the author is trying to point out about the sources. So there's a lot that can be taken from this one paragraph.
Hey, Jessica, we have a couple of questions here. Yeah. The numbers in the parentheses, are they page numbers? And I think...
Where? In here?
Yeah, those are not, right?
Here.
But sometimes we do have the page numbers when we're actually quoting something.
Yeah, if there's a quotation, a direct quote, then you would add the page number. But here, this is APA 7. We just include the year of this.
Oh, it was on the previous slide, they said.
Let's see.
Oh, those are actually...
Oh yeah, this is not APA. This article was published in a journal that doesn't follow APA 7. So these are the parenthetical, sorry, I should have pointed that out. Parenthetical citations. I don't know what style this is. I want to say it's MLA.
It would either indicate an endnote or a specific reference from our references. So depending upon what the journal requires, it could also be, the number could also refer to an endnote, but I think in this case, it's actually the number of the reference.
Yeah, so there was the reference list for this article is numbered. And so I think this is either MLA or AMA. I can't remember because it's a healthcare journal, but these are numbered references. But they correspond to the bibliographic citation. So this is the equivalent of a parenthetical citation in APA where you list out the author's name and the year, because you're including the citation just in parentheses, either at the end of the sentence or in the middle of the sentence.
And a couple of people are saying that this is a Vancouver style.
Vancouver style, thank you. There's so many different styles.
Yes. And then there was another point, just real quick, Jessica. If someone is using the active voice when they're talking, they're writing out, then the citations don't reference as easily. Do you have any suggestions for that?
I want to make sure I understand. Say that again. If you're using active voice.
It says, it says it's often not possible for me to use cite references appropriately with software when active voice is used. Can you please advise on this? And I think it's and Mohammed, help us out here on this, on clarifying. But if do you mean the actual verb choice, or just when you are actually using the voice feature? Oh, he says, I mean, you can't put only the year in brackets with the software.
Oh, that's a software limitation.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just have to go through and edit that without relying on the software before you submit it in order to address those instances of passive and active voice. Yeah, different softwares there's so many out there now, but it can make it challenging, but you'll just have to disable the software and to edit it to change the passive to active correctly.
Yeah, I know with some that you have to actually program it in, and then once you program it in, it'll accept it.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I'm very old school. I don't use any reference management softwares. Okay, so I'm looking at the time. This is our third example. And so I took this out of a journal article that is also not APA 7, but again, these numbers correspond to the references are in order of that they're cited, their numbers. So you would look up, number 8 in the reference list, and that would be the citation. And so here we have a transition phrase that is the purpose of it is to clarify a point. So the author is saying this means educators, ... And then here in this 3-line sentence, this author is introducing a direct quote using a signal phrase with a neutral reporting verb. So in his account of educationalization in contemporary Great Britain, Bridge shows, that's the reporting verb, how this tendency is ... And then we have this quotation. And so this again goes back to this idea of avoiding dropped quotations. This would be an entirely different paragraph if the author had just put in a full sentence this quotation saying an honest conviction. You would immediately wonder, like, well, why are we hearing from this person? Why is this important? Is this person credible? So you're taking the time to introduce that quote if you're not going to paraphrase it. And then we have another very simple transition word, the word but, where they're contrasting what was just said with the block quote that is to come. I think I have one more example. Okay, and this is a series of transitional phrases to connect sources. And so this is an example of where you may look at numbering, like 1, 2, 3, a second, a third. These are all citations or sources about organizational factors that undermines the effects of educationalizing social problems. And so the author, in order to kind of connect these sources together based on similar points that the author wants to make, is they say things like one organizational factor, a second organizational factor, a third organizational factor. So that's a great example of intentionally using specific transition words and phrases in order to improve the cohesion of a paper, to help the reader see the connections between sources, instead of just going right into, the finding of the source in a second paragraph. You add that topic sentence to help the reader connect the dots. I think that's the last example I have. This is just my attempt to kind of pull this all together in a poll. So I would just love to hear from you. Look these over and tell me which passage is appropriately cited and supported based off of what we've discussed today. And I'm going to launch the poll so that you can comment. Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to launch it so you can read it in the actual poll itself. Okay.
Jessica, it looks like the poll cut off a couple of words,
Oh, here, let me go.
at least on my side.
Let me see if I can go back and launch it. Can you still see the poll while this is up?
Yeah.
Good. I just can't see it. I hate Zoom webinars. It doesn't make it easy to present and manage the chat or polls. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll, look at the results. Good, almost all of you got it correct. 93% said number 2, which is correct. I'm going to go back and show that quote or that option and just kind of talk you through it. So in A, this is a drop quote. The author says a number of journalists have been critical of genetic engineering, and then we have a full sentence that is a quote. So I use this in the beginning of the presentation to make the point that we want to avoid drop quotes. And so a more appropriate way to include that quote would be providing information about the source. So here, now it says Lisa Turner in a 2021 article for the magazine Better Nutrition calls attention to the unpredictable nature of genetic engineering, Turner states. See how that is much easier to read? It's more cohesive. It tells me as a reader who Lisa Turner is and why you're sharing this quote with me. So that is what I mean by introducing a source instead of just dropping a quote in the writing. In a perfect world, I would also encourage you to avoid a direct quotation and instead paraphrase, but there are instances when it is appropriate to include a direct quote. You just want to make sure that you're introducing the source and providing some context for the reader, so the quote, doesn't come out of nowhere. So with that said, I'd love to just take a moment. I'm checking the time. We don't have long, but I'll take any questions and comments that you have. Or if you're ready to jump off of here, I also want to share this special offer with you. If you want to join our academic writing community, you can get the first month half off with the promo code half off. And then after that, it's $99 a month, or you can pause or cancel at any time. So with that said, I'm going to open up the floor for questions and comments. For those of you who are curious, I will be sending out the recording and the presentation and all of the handouts for today in an email.
So Jessica, there is a question. Would you advise putting a list of authors writing about a topic in a table format, or rather writing it out in paragraph format? Table headings could be author, topic, quotation.
I don't understand.
like instead of like basically taking notes with the table format on different authors who are talking about a specific topic, or going ahead and putting it in a paragraph form for each author.
Yeah, so when I'm reading articles and preparing to write, I love to use a table. I'll organize my notes in an annotation table before I write in narrative form, because before you write in narrative form, you have to have some sort of grasp in terms of what is the overall sort of perspective in the literature, what are maybe the gaps. And you really can't do that until you've taken the time to go through all of the articles on a certain aspect of the topic and kind of organize your ideas elsewhere. So I do tend to take notes in a table where I separate it out according to each author. And then I'll use that to that helps me identify patterns or discrepancies or limitations. And then I'll use that to help me actually go into the write narrative form. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, I think so. And then here's another one I was just responding to. So in the last example, the date of the publication was not put in parentheses. Was that APA, and is that legal in APA?
Is it legal? We're not going to go to jail. So here
it's, yeah, you actually say
2021 article.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this could have been done in several ways. It could have said Lisa Turner, parentheses 2021. But typically you're adding the year in APA after the last name of the author. And so there's a couple ways to do that. In this example, it says Lisa Turner in a 2021 article. That is the citation. And then you include the page number after the direct quote. Another way you could do this is say Turner, parentheses 2021 right here would also be correct, but it's included in the right before the direct quote. So that would be acceptable.
And I think that is it. Everyone is saying thank you.
Good, perfect.
Yeah.
We're going to go ahead and here I'm going to pause this. For those of you who are still in the room,